I'm here with Dr. Mindy Pelz, one of my favorite people in the world. So, Dr. Pelz, what did you have for breakfast?
It's a hard question to answer, but the first thing I'm going to say is nothing. But then there's a few things I had after I had nothing. So let's start off with, honestly, first thing I always have is a cup of coffee. I do coffee in my fasting window. I put a little MCT oil in it. So if we're going to call that breakfast, then that was the first thing that went in. And then what time is it? It's like 11 o'clock. So I've got a long list of podcast interviews today. So about 20 minutes ago, I had a keto cup, and
Nice.
primarily just to keep energy up, keep ketones flowing, but make sure that my brain had plenty of fat. So that's it. That's what I've had so far this morning.
Hey, today's video is sponsored by Thrive Market. Go ahead and check them out down below in the description. They are an online membership-based grocery store, so just definitely recommend you check them out. So whatever kind of diet strategy you're doing, whether it's keto, whether it's fasting, whether it's paleo, you've got to check them out. They have all kinds of new foods coming out all the time. Gets delivered to your doorstep. It's super, super convenient, really cool. You just get it in a few days and you can sort by diet type. Unbelievably awesome. They've been a sponsor on this channel for years. So that link is down below in the description. Make sure you check them out. Seriously, like some of the new items they have, whether you eat carbs or don't eat carbs, are just awesome. My pantry is stock full of it. Check them out down below.
Nice. Well, perfect. And I usually echo with what I had. Yeah, this morning it was like a really weird, I'm kind of doing a little bit of a modified protein sparing modified fast, sort of, but not super low calorie. So I just had, like, sounds funny, but I just had like 13 ounces of lean chicken breast. So that's all I've had today, which is so I knew you'd have something interesting. But
yeah, amazing. Are you trying to do like fast mimicking, or you?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. I've got some, I'm doing some filming next week where I just need to be as lean as possible. And I always find that when I go protein sparing modified fast, for me, I don't recommend it for everybody, but for someone that has a fair bit of muscle and you're not, like, it just works really well for me, being so like fat adapted and keto adapted. As soon as I strip away the fats temporarily, it just falls right off. So it's just not the easiest to adhere to. It's not, I don't recommend it for, there's a reason it's typically like a medically supervised diet. It's definitely aggressive, but it's kind of fun to play around.
Of course.
So we want to jump into thyroid today. We want to talk about like warning signs of thyroid. We want to talk about, or low thyroid. We want to talk about kind of the interplay between, thyroid and insulin resistance, which is a very interesting thing. So can you kind of just give everyone an overview on like what the thyroid is, like maybe what T3, T4, and TSH is, sort of in a nutshell?
Yeah. I think that's the best place to start the conversation, because when you walk into your medical doctor's office, there's usually one measurement of TSH, and that is what they base your whole thyroid performance off of. But that's really one of like 11 markers you need to look at. So if you understand how thyroid hormones work, you'll understand why those other markers become important. And basically your brain, your hypothalamus, pituitary, they create a signal. That signal is TSH. It goes to the thyroid and it tells the thyroid to make T4. So the thyroid makes very little T3, which is the bioactive version of the thyroid hormone that actually will help you have all the beautiful effects you want from a thyroid hormone. But all your thyroid makes is T4. So T4 has to go on to the liver and the gut and get broken down into T3. And then T3 has to get into the cell. So it's a team. And then once it gets into the cell sends a signal back up to the brain and tells the brain how much thyroid hormone it's actually activating. So when we dive into the idea behind insulin resistance, we have to realize at what point of that pattern, of that whole system, is insulin resistance affecting. You got to look at things like, where are toxins impacting thyroid function? Where does liver function come in? Where does gut health? All of these start to affect how somebody's thyroid performs, which is honestly why looking at one number like TSH is of no help. It's so limited, and I can't believe that we haven't expanded beyond that.
Yeah, I remember, and I know my wife won't mind me mentioning this, and I won't go into exquisite detail, but my wife has Hashimoto, and I remember, which is, for those that don't know, an autoimmune condition where essentially your body is rejecting your thyroid, colloquially. And then I remember that it was just like TSH levels and that was it, right? They didn't really like look at anything else. They literally made that diagnosis based upon that one number. Now, we found further on down the line it was indeed true, but it's kind of scary that they even make diagnosis off just one number, right? Like it's just so it's kind of so it's interesting that you mentioned that. So does the thyroid actually, does the hormone ultimately goes and it binds to different receptors throughout the body, right? It's not like it's just free flowing doing its thing.
So here's the crazy thing. There is a receptor site for T3 on every single cell in your body, every single one. So if your thyroid hormone is off, specifically T3, any system in your body can be off, which is why it's such a major concept. But yet again, we're not looking at free T3 versus total T3 often. We're only looking at that brain component. So every single cell needs T3. And if you don't have T3 going into those cells, you're going to have everything from a sluggish energy to weight gain, which is what people tend to think of thyroid as. But it can even affect, there's a lot of receptor sites for T3 in the brain. So it can put you into depression. You might have trouble metabolically switching over into getting yourself into a fat adapted state. You might notice your whole hormonal system is off and you have more perimenopausal symptoms. All of that can be influenced by just that one part of the thyroid hormone being off.
That's so interesting. And it's like when we think about the idea behind thyroid being something that is really involved in a lot of stages of just energy manufacturing in the body, or the conversion of, let's say, the energy that we eat into energy that's actually usable, that would make sense. And some of the things I remember reading some articles before about how thyroid can influence glucose uptake, right? So it's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? If someone is kind of having these symptoms of insulin resistance, and then they go further on down the line and find, oh, okay, well, my thyroid's out of whack. It seems like it's kind of a two-headed beast, like one can feed the other, vice versa.
Yeah. I think all hormones are like that, though. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, we're in a big loop. All hormones are being produced, and then the brain is registering their production, and then the pituitary is sending a whole cascade of hormonal events down to the organs that are necessary. So I think that's what makes them so hard, is just when you get them where you want them, now something shifts. Yeah. But when it comes to thyroid, if you're insulin resistant, let's just say you're on medication. We could give you the greatest, most perfect dose of, let's say, levothyroxine or Synthroid, and now your thyroid's making T4. It still has to go to the liver and the gut to get converted into T3, and that T3 still has to get into the cell. So if we're seeing glucose go up because you're insulin resistant, I don't care how great that thyroid is performing, it's not going into the cell.
Yeah.
And that is what is the discussion that's not being had. I mean, this is why you and I are probably so passionate about insulin resistance, because it is the solution. You solve that and you solve so many problems. And one of the thyroid problems you solve is now that thyroid hormone can actually get into the cell and activate the energy systems, the mitochondria within there, so that you actually feel good and are using that thyroid hormone for your advantage.
Yeah, totally. And that brings up a really interesting point, because I've talked to particularly women when they have lower thyroid. And I think I remember seeing a statistic. I don't want to pull it totally out of the side of my mouth, but it's some number. It was seemingly large. Like, most people that have thyroid issues tend to be women. Like, women are much more prone to thyroid issues. So I kind of going to pick on the women here for a minute. But when I talk to a lot of ladies that are dealing with thyroid issues, they're usually concerned that, oh, if I restrict my calories or if I put myself into a deficit, it's going to make things worse, because it's, and I know you're really good at debunking this and kind of talking about this whole process and kind of caloric restriction and how it interplays, and even fasting and how it interplays with thyroid. Because I know a lot of people, I don't want to fast because I'm hypothyroid. It's going to shut my thyroid down more. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, no, this is my favorite thing to debunk, because let's just start with this idea that if you are struggling with your thyroid hormones, the best thing you can do is get yourself insulin sensitive. That's the first step. And then the best way to get yourself insulin sensitive is fasting. So, let's just start with that baseline. But what we've done now is we've equated fasting with calorie restriction. And I just want to say right here and now, the way that you and I teach fasting is not calorie restriction. It is time restricted eating. And when you eat, you've got to eat. So women that are shying away from fasting because they're worried about tanking their hormones, just make sure when you open up that eating window that you are actually moving into foods that and are eating enough calories. You're not restricting calories. The second thing I want to say on it, and this was a study I analyzed a couple of years ago over and over again, it was showed that in a calorie restricted state, we do see and then they equated calorie restriction in the study to fasting, to time restriction. So it was a little bit of both time restriction and calorie restriction. What they found is T3 went down. So they came out of the study and said it's tanking T3. Anybody who's got a thyroid problem should not fast. And they just didn't emphasize calorie restriction. But then when I went on and actually went into the nuggets of the study, and then I followed that to more studies, what they found is it was very much like Walter Longo's white blood cell study. In his white blood cell, it went down, but then when food was brought back in, those white blood cells went up. The same thing happens with thyroid. You see a reduction in T3, but the minute you eat, you actually see an amplification of T3, and if you eat healthy foods, you're going to get even more T3 production. It's just that they haven't been telling us the rest of that story.
Interesting. Yeah, it's at the end of the day, I mean, you were just trying to restore the ability for the mitochondria to process fuel. I mean, plain and simple. And I think that's what people tend to forget. I think it's easy to think that the thyroid is like this big master switch of our metabolism. And I think that's where things get really foggy. It's like that is this really common notion that almost everything is regulated by our thyroid. Now, as you mentioned, a lot of cells, obviously all cells have interaction with thyroid to some degree, but that doesn't mean that thyroid is casting this massive cascade on all of the cells. It's a delicate dance in an orchestra. And if you're remaining in a point where your body is insulin sensitive and able to utilize nutrients, then again, it kind of restores that feedback loop altogether. So it's interesting. It's one of the things I personally feel that if people are having thyroid issues, it's not as a result of reducing calories. And even still, if you are reducing calories and you have a reduction in thyroid, that is usually a temporary result of the restriction of calories, just as you mentioned. And once caloric intake is increased again, those values restore just kind of back to normal.
Yeah, which is, again, I think, and I'd be curious your opinion on this. I feel like one of the downsides of us looking at studies and then showing up on YouTube or showing up on social media and saying, well, in this study, this isolated thing happened. We have to remember that now we just have a data point, but when it comes to fasting, a large part of the conversation that's not being had is, well, what happens when we reintroduce food?
Yeah.
And I think for the most part, when you're dealing with metabolic syndrome, it's pretty impressive that when you fast, you can really overturn some of these metabolic markers. And if you go back into food and you eat poorly, you're still getting a metabolic upside, even if you're eating poorly. Now, I'm not saying don't eat poorly, but with thyroid, you don't get that same upside if you move out of your fasting window into more calorie restriction, even into a little more keto. If you have a thyroid problem, you might want to raise your glucose just a tad when you open up that eating window so that you are able to make the hormone and really get it to be more prolific using that tool of feast, famine cycling.
That's interesting. Yeah. And I remember seeing some data before too, that, carbohydrates do tend to stimulate thyroid function, but it's not this crazy amount. It's one of those things where, okay, well then is keto bad for thyroid? No, it doesn't necessarily work like that, but you will notice that, yes, when you do have carbohydrates. Now, and then there's even a hypothesis out there, it hasn't been vetted out, but I remember talking about this as theory, that perhaps there is actually thyroid hormone involved in the metabolism of glucose in the first place. Like, we understand there's an interplay, but perhaps there is this direct relationship between thyroid and glucose metabolism in the first place. So again, which came first, the chicken or the egg? When you potentially have these carbohydrates and you have this elevation in thyroid, is the elevation in thyroid simply to deal with the glucose in the first place? or is it fixing everything? And I think that's the problem that people have, is they think, okay, well, carbs are going to drive up my thyroid, so carbs must be good for the thyroid, good for the metabolism. Well, we have to stop and think that globally, maybe we are increasing metabolic rate temporarily through the digestion of these carbohydrates, and thyroid is just required for that. So it's kind of to your point, like when you look at this mechanistic stuff and you look at one isolated event or one isolated data point and you put it out there onto the interwebs, first of all, it's easy for people to grab that and like run with just that one piece and not take a step back and look at it globally. So
one thought on that, I just want to, and I know you are a proponent of this, is as much as we love ketones, we have to remember that there is another fuel source, and it's called glucose. And it's not one that we're trying to shy away from. We're just trying to make sure that we're going in and out of ketones and glucose. And when it comes to the theory you were just talking about, like which came first, does the thyroid hormone raise glucose, or does glucose raise thyroid? Either way, we can't lose sight of the fact that we still need to raise glucose in an appropriate manner.
I totally agreed. And I think that what I try to remind people is that, glucose is only a problem when it's not being used. That's it, period.
Well said.
I mean, I don't care if you're keto or you're not keto. I don't care if you're an athlete that eats 400 grams of carbs a day or an athlete that's keto. It doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is, are you utilizing the fuel that you're giving yourself, period? Because excess fuels in general, whether it's excess fats or excess carbohydrates, are a problem. Lipotoxicity is just as much of a problem as glucose toxicity if they're both elevated and you're not using them. So, and I know that's a point with low thyroid as well, is like you mentioned, it kind of lowers that metabolic switching. So it makes it so it's harder to kind of get into that fat oxidation. So, but I want to jump into kind of some meat and potatoes of this a little bit. Like, what are some things that people can look out for? Okay, so maybe they went to the doctor, they looked at their TSH, they saw it's a little bit out of whack, but they don't want to necessarily take that number to the bank. I always try to tell people, okay, like, are you symptomatic? That matters, right? Like in the world of low testosterone, I tell people, I don't think testosterone is the end all be all. If you're a guy and your testosterone levels are relatively low, but you're not symptomatic, then I don't think it's a problem, right? It's the symptoms that are the problem, not just a number. So let's say they go to the doctor, their TSH is out of whack, is super elevated, and just maybe their numbers are out of whack, but they need to sort of validate it with some feelings and symptoms. What kind of things do people feel?
Well, I think the most common one that people think is energy. Let's just start there. Like, I have low energy, but you and I both know there's a lot more to the energy conversation. But you will notice that you're just kind of sluggish in energy. You also, of course, you can gain weight. But again, these are all things that you don't necessarily need to go at the thyroid to raise. You can go at the cell from an insulin resistant standpoint and be able to get that thyroid hormone to work better. Outside of that, I think for women especially, it's hair loss. Yes. That's a big one. And the other one we see a lot in fasters is that thyroid storm, like that anxious kind of heart palpitation that can show up. That can also be, if you combine these, and I would say with hormones in general, it's the combination of these symptoms. It's not one isolated symptom on its own. But I know I'm dealing with a thyroid patient when they're depressed, their hair is falling out, they have no energy, they're gaining weight, their cycles are off, and maybe they have some mental clarity. And then you dive into cold hands and feet with some heart palpitations. We got ourselves a thyroid case.
Yeah, so I have a study pulled up that was kind of interesting that was just relevant to this, because I know that, without going out on a tangent, I know that Dr. Pelz is a huge fan of cold exposure, as am I. Like, I'm a big fan of just for multiple different benefits. There's an interesting paper that took a look at when you look at people that have hypothyroid, they do not get the actual caloric basal metabolic rate benefit from cold exposure. So what that essentially means is they don't respond to it. So they don't get the cold induced thermogenesis, right? So like, if a healthy person were to go into a cold room, or a healthy person were to go into like an ice bath, they're going to get a pretty big metabolic increase just to warm up the body. Like, sometimes it's as much as like 100 to 150 calories per day out of that, which is pretty significant. They find that although people that are hypothyroid still see an improvement, they don't see nearly as much of an improvement as people that are not hypothyroid. But when they put them in this particular case, they medicated them, they restored thyroid levels, then it went up to that of the normal people, the healthy people. So
Interesting.
it's so interesting, yeah, because it just paints a clear picture, right? And mechanistically, can't really explain everything that's going on there, except for the fact that it's pure energy manufacturing. And that is, and if you're, let's say you require more energy to warm up your body, but that energy system, that motor is running on 4 cylinders instead of 8 cylinders, then you're not going to create as much heat. You're not going to create as much energy. So it's just, I found that very interesting. And
I actually think you could take it down to the mitochondria. So I don't know what the length of that study was. Like, how long did they go in every day for 30 days? I'd be curious if you took those thyroid patients and you just kept them at them, because cold exposure is going to help re-energize those mitochondria. But in a thyroid patient, if you've got an insulin resistance issue, then it's going to take a little more cold therapy to get those mitochondria to wake up. But combine that maybe with some fasting and some ketones, maybe even they could have thrown exogenous ketones at it. And then do it over time. And eventually you're going to see those mitochondria wake up, even in a person who's clinically got a thyroid issue.
No, I totally agree. And the study was, I mean, I can actually read a section from it, but it was a 3-month study. So they did 90 minutes of whether it was cold exposure in water combined with just putting them in a cold room. This is what's interesting. We talk about cold exposure. I mean, I can't remember the study. We could have talked about it like years ago, but I mean, even just putting people in like a 62 or 63 degree room actually increases basal metabolic rate significantly. So I always tell people, I'm like, just whatever, keep your house a little bit cold, or it's all good. But so it says energy expenditure during warm conditions increased from an average of 1,330 calories per day in the hypothyroid state, and it increased to 1,442 calories per day following treatment. So they actually did increase over the course of that 90 days. So even though their response was less than a healthy person, they actually did improve over that 90-day period, which is pretty cool.
And it was 90 minutes a day?
So thermogenesis was measured by indirect calorimetry during warm conditions and after cold stimulus of 90 minutes at the beginning of the study, and after a 3-month thyroid hormone replacement period as well. So basically, they were just doing cold-induced thermogenesis. So in this case, without going into details of the study, they probably just put them in a cold room and probably also did some ice bath. Yeah, that's what I'm
wondering.
Yeah. Which is interesting, right?
Yeah, it's a total twist on cold therapy, because when you were first saying that, I'm like, nobody could go in a cold bath for 90 minutes.
Yeah, no way.
But to your point about a cold room at 62 degrees, that's actually brilliant. Like, just don't turn your heat on in the winter, depending on where you live, and you might be getting some cold therapy to improve your thyroid.
Yeah, no, I drive my wife crazy because I always it's super cold in the house. Not necessarily for that reason, but I just think about that whenever when I looked at this study, I'm like, oh, my wife would kill me. But
yeah, it might not be. Yeah, don't do that. You want her to be happy for sure.
So you mentioned the hair loss piece. I think in mechanistically, I saw some stuff that was interesting, and this because I know there's going to be men watching this too, whether they're watching it for their significant other, their loved ones, or whatever, or they're watching it for themselves. Interesting, like with women, you see this hair loss. With men, you see a lot of really dry skin. And when it's kind of this patchy skin, and just, again, it's the same kind of pathway. It's like one of the first dominoes to fall when energy manufacturing is deficient, or just, let's just call it deranged, is you're going to see a change in sort of the oil glands and everything like that. That can obviously affect hair. But one of the immediate thing that men see is a lot of times they'll see it more manifest like in dry skin and sort of like super chapped lips. And I know I have chapped lips right now, but that's not my thyroid. I just have chapped lips.
I can't tell.
But so it's kind of interesting. It works along that same way. And it's kind of the same kind of thing on the scalp. So it's like the first thing that's going to go is going to be the hair. It's going to be the skin, because it's like the closest line of defense as far as like dysfunctional energy is concerned.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting, as you were talking, I was thinking the other side of the thyroid equation or conversation that needs to be had is, yes, there's this insulin resistance point, but there's also a toxicity piece. So when toxins start to build in the body, they always say that the thyroid is the canary in the coal mine. When it starts to go off, it's an indicator that toxic levels have gone up. Yeah. And when we look at things like hair and skin, everything from heavy metals to mold to glyphosate to all kinds of plastics, they sit in those receptor sites for hormones and for nutrients like aminos, minerals, vitamins. So it would make sense that as the toxic load went up, your hair would go down, or would be affected. Your skin would be affected. You're going to throw testosterone off. In women, you're going to throw estrogen off. Estrogen is going to have a part of hair as far as like hair staying on your head and staying full and luscious, as I always say. In men, you could see a change in skin. But I don't think we can necessarily say it's a thyroid problem, therefore it needs to be treated as a thyroid problem. I feel like the conversation is going back to what deficiency is revealing itself because of the toxic load that's causing the thyroid problem.
Yeah, totally. And that comes right back to that whole master switch thing. It's like, I think a lot of it has to do with what's been overhyped over the last 10 years. I think there was, especially like 5 years ago, this big trend in talking about thyroid. And I think a lot of people just took it and ran with it, and they think of it as the master switch. And I like your sort of analogy of kind of the canary in the coal mine. It really does. It's just illuminating that you have other issues going on, right? Yeah. It's not. Yeah. And the impact of the thyroid directly on caloric burn and, your caloric expenditure, although it's very important, it's not as much as people think, right? It's much more about, it's not like, it's like if you were to, I'm going to go out on a limb and completely just say something random that's definitely not data, but if you were to remove someone's thyroid, their metabolism doesn't go to zero, right? It's not like this is the catalyst for everything going on, but it is certainly a catalyst for a lot of these like just micro interactions that are happening at a hormone and cellular level, which...
Yeah. And I think that's super well said, because the flip side of that is it would be easy to like hear me say, well, your hair loss may be a thyroid problem. And then people go, oh, yeah, it's a thyroid problem. And then we start treating the thyroid problem. But the next question to ask is, well, what part of the thyroid is off? Yeah. And that's why I like starting this conversation with, look at all these organs that it has to be the brain, the thyroid, the liver, the gut, the cell, even the adrenals play a part in this. This is a full-on team approach. And when we look at always blaming the thyroid as why we're gaining weight or why we can't lose weight, we really are only looking at one. That'd be like blaming a soccer team win on one player. You can't do that. It's the whole team coming together that we need to look at.
No, that's exactly well said. And when you think of it, I think sometimes people like to find one thing that is wrong, and they get sort of this, they want to glom onto that. And I see it a lot where their identity becomes wrapped up in it, right? It's like, this is, okay, I have a thyroid issue. Okay, that may be the case, but they let their identity get so wrapped up in that thyroid issue that they really do neglect the fact that, okay, well, there's a million other things going on that triggered this. And so I know the people that are watching, they're saying, okay, well, this is awesome information. Like, what can I do? Like, okay, my thyroid's out of whack. Maybe it's illuminated that I have other issues. I mean, what advice would you give people that are seeing or feeling some of these symptoms? They don't want to necessarily go on a hormone replacement of some kind. What would you recommend?
Yeah, well, let's start with, for sure, get yourself insulin sensitive. So, because I would almost start at the opposite end. Let's start with the cell. Let's get your cells so that they can even bring in the thyroid hormone, because I don't know about you, but I've seen so many people that go on thyroid medication and then they still feel horrible. Like I would say that's like over 50% of the people. And part of that is because that cell isn't able to receive it. So make sure you're eating good fats, make sure you're getting off the processed carbohydrates, and make sure you're not ingesting toxins. So that would be like, and then fasting, I always say, eat nature's carbs, eat a lot of meat, eat good fat, and tack that on to a lot of time restricted eating or fasting, and you're going to make yourself insulin sensitive. Like that's where we need to start. But then if we work backwards, let's say you've been on 18 rounds of antibiotics, or a woman who's been on birth control for 2 years. What are you doing to keep your gut in good shape? Because your gut's going to have to break down that T4 as it comes through from the thyroid. So, making sure you're eating enough of polyphenol, probiotic, prebiotic foods. I do think there's a time and place for carnivore. I've seen even with things like Hashimoto's for thyroid, because it creates this upregulates T regulatory cells and calms things down. So knowing what food style your gut responds best to is great. Then we got to go to the liver, and we got to go, okay, maybe it's time to bring down the alcohol. Maybe you need to eat more bitter foods. Maybe you need a good old detox to be able to let that liver be able to break T4 down. Then when we go to the thyroid, iodine is where people usually go. But I've found in all the testing we've done, not everybody has an iodine issue. So I think it's more about detox. Get off. What's going on in your skin? What's going on in your hair? Are you still wearing a toxic cologne? Are you still eating foods that are sprayed with pesticides? This is where thyroid function has this toxic connection. Do you have a heavy metal load? Maybe you have high in lead. Maybe you've got a mouthful of amalgams. Those things will affect how much T4 can be put out. And then the last piece is also toxins, which is your brain, the part of your brain, the hypothalamus and pituitary, they are not protected by a blood-brain barrier. So toxins really start to play an issue when we are dealing with some of these hormonal patterns that we see. How do we start detoxifying the brain? How do we stop bringing toxins in? And now when you put that all together, you go, whoa, okay, I didn't say medication at all. There's all those are possibilities of what you can do to bring some balance back to this system.
What I like about everything you said there is nothing was additive. It was all taking away. Right. And in a positive way, right? I think it's common to say, okay, I need to add this in, or I need to add this food, or I need to add this. I mean, yes, to a certain degree that can apply, but almost everything you're saying is like, no, you more so need to get back to baseline and start there, because if you're still having issues there, it's easier to add things in to, a stock pot with just broth than a soup that's already made with a million ingredients. It also makes it easier to isolate a variable and see what might work for you. And I think when you mentioned, carnivore, it's like obviously mixed opinions on carnivore, and it's whatever. It is what it is. At the very least, it's something that's going to take you down to a minimalist basic approach so you can isolate variables easier. And that's what I always like about any kind of simple protocol. It's just let's see what we can do to isolate variables. And I think one thing that I've heard a lot is, again, people not wanting to exercise when it comes down to the thyroid. They think the same thing. Like there's this common well, I shouldn't say it's a misconception, because if you are over exercising, like you're one of the, ultra marathoner, especially for women that are over exercising, yes, you can drive your hormones into the ground, including your thyroid. But I would say the lion's share of at least Americans are not in that situation. And exercising is only going to drive things up.
Yes.
I mentioned this in a video that actually literally released today. It's kind of ironic. It's probably fresh in my mind. People forget that there is a delicate balance between the food that you take in and your expenditure. And a common kind of question is, well, is it better to increase my metabolism or reduce body fat or reduce weight by reducing my caloric intake or increasing my exercise? Well, it's a good question. And in the spirit of talking about the thyroid, like my humble opinion on this, and there's some data to back it up with like what's called G-Flux and everything like that. But I'm a big fan of like, you should still try to be able to eat as much as you can without gaining weight, obviously, while still exercising as much as you can without running yourself into the ground. So to put matters in a very simple way, I would much rather someone eat 4,000 calories a day, and this is simple, and burn 4,000 calories a day, then eat 1,500 calories a day and burn 1,500 calories per day. It's like, and that's again a very simple, overly simplified way of putting it. But the more that you can move, you can accommodate more food, but of course, good, healthy food. So how you get yourself into that deficit really just depends, right? But what I don't want people to do is say, okay, well, I'm just going to reduce my calories down to 1,200 or 1,000 and not move and sit on the couch and fast, right? So it's
well, but now you're in calorie restriction, which the studies are showing isn't great for the thyroid.
Exactly, right?
Yeah. So to your point, I like where you're going with this is like, it'd be better from a thyroid perspective to eat more food and move more and make sure that you're getting enough nourishment there.
Yeah, well, and G-Flux is just a super interesting thing. And I mean, you practically need to, do your dissertation in that world to really understand it, because I mean, it starts getting into really complex math, really. But essentially with G-Flux, like if you take someone that is eating 2,000 calories per day and burning 2,000 calories per day, and you take someone that is eating 5,000 calories per day and burning 5,000 calories per day, on the surface, you'd say they're both at net zero. That's actually incorrect. The person that's eating 5,000 and burning 5,000 is probably burning close to 400 or 500 more calories because of what's called energy flux. And that's literally like the momentum, the amount of energy and sort of inertia it takes to get that whole regulatory process working at that level. And clearly it's a very mathematical thing that I can't explain in detail, but it's fascinating. When I first learned that, I'm like, wow, that is really interesting, because it's not as simple as, wow, just calories in, calories out. Like calories in, calories out at a high level versus calories in, calories out at a low level, you get this additional burn. And that's why, like, this is a very almost woo-woo witch doctor way of putting it. But if you look at if you're in the presence of an athlete, like a big professional athlete that's just a giant person that's just, you can almost feel their energy, right? Like this person is just, and like I heard Alan Aragon put it in a very eloquent way. He was like, they're fluxing at a different capacity, and you can literally feel it. Like the energy that like an athlete gives off when they're a big person that moves a lot, that is also lean, they literally give off a different energy than someone that is sick and dying. And it's just because so I know it sounds weird to put that, but I mean, at a certain rate, it does actually matter.
No, I actually think you could probably prove that because you have increased the thermogenesis that's going on because of the influx of food. So the body is going to have to raise its metabolism. Plus, you've now thrown movement at it. So as opposed to the person that sits on the couch and maybe only eats, 1,000 calories, there's less energy in the overall cells being produced. So that
Totally
makes perfect sense to me. The other thing I would say on that we haven't talked about with thyroid is that when you are in a calorie deficit place, you often create more cortisol. And when cortisol comes in, your body, your thyroid actually doesn't make T4, it makes reverse T3. So and then reverse T3 goes in and blocks those T3 receptor sites. So another real key to thyroid is you can't stress your way to a good thyroid. So if you're going to do that by manipulating calories or fasting too much with not refueling in the proper amount, you're going to make more reverse T3, which is going to tank you as well. So, and this is kind of the lesson of all hormones is we need to have a balance. We can't muscle our way or aggressively work out our way to better hormonal health. Yeah. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. You're not going to win. It's definitely,
you'll never win. Yeah.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because that's, in the fasting community, it's easy for people to take it too far. And I always suggest, like, whether it's caloric restriction or fasting, you need to have sort of an objective marker that tells you when too much is too much and when it's time to stop. And, one thing I will say, I'm obviously a proponent of lower carb protocols, but I will say that insulin, when properly managed and properly utilized, first of all, let's get it out in the open that you require insulin. Insulin is not a bad thing. Insulin is only a bad thing when it doesn't come back down. Insulin is also probably the biggest hormone that can blunt cortisol. So that's a danger, because it explains why when we're stressed, we crave carbs so much, right? We really do. It's like that insulin will blunt that cortisol eventually, but that mix of insulin and cortisol at the same time is what also causes a problem. So when you're stressed out and you're going for those hyperpalatable sweet snacks, that is when you are more prone to visceral fat accumulation, just because of the glucocorticoid receptors in the visceral fat. So what I usually suggest is, like, if you are really stressed out and things like that, obviously keep protein values high so you're not catabolizing. And if you're going to have carbs, as cliche as it sounds, this is the time where you really need to be like combining carbs with protein, combining carbs with fiber. It's the last time you want to be having this aggressive insulin spike. Insulin might help you combat that cortisol, but not if it's chronically elevated.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. And then where my brain goes with that is one step further. Think about how intelligent your body is. When you're stressed, it was going to want to keep glucose high so that you can run from the bear. But you're not running from the bear. You're sitting at your desk. So now glucose is high, and now and insulin starts to go up. And now that just to your point, it's excess. So it's going to have to be stored somewhere. So I think what we don't give the body enough respect for always doing the right thing at the right time. We especially don't want to know that when it's doing something that's giving us an adverse feeling in our body.
Yeah, I think what's kind of funny is what sums it up is, like, our bodies know what they're doing, where things like people say, okay, well, what should I eat? What should I do? Okay, well, when we start having weird intervention with our body's natural rhythms and what it's supposed to do, that's when we run into problems, right? We're supposed to have periods of time that we don't eat. We're supposed to have periods of time that we eat. We're supposed to have periods of time that we're in the sun. We're supposed to have periods. And it's so not sexy to talk about. Like, okay, well, the best thing you can do is live a healthy lifestyle. Get sunlight, get sleep, which go hand in hand. Take periods of time away from your food, whether you fast or not. But also get moving, get active. And hey, guess what? Let's eliminate the hyperpalatable processed stuff that is very unnatural and doesn't belong in our body in the first place.
Right. Yeah. And, we want to overcomplicate it, especially with the thyroid. I don't understand why the thyroid, I mean, literally, I feel like people walk around with little posters like, I have a thyroid problem. I have a thyroid problem. And then they go searching their whole life for the thyroid solution. Yeah. But what you just gave was the thyroid solution. Yeah. It's just going to take work. It takes some responsibility. And it's not a magic bullet. Give it a couple of months and everything will start to regulate. But we really want the one thing, and I see this in the biohacking world, okay, well, I don't want a medication, but give me, how long, should I be cold plunging, or which red light should I do? When it comes to hormones, especially the thyroid, doesn't work like that. Get your lifestyle in order first, and then 9 out of 10 times, you're not going to have a thyroid problem anymore.
Yeah, I think you just nailed it. So with that, in an effort to keep this video sweet and succinct and just with good tangible information, I think that's where we'll wrap it up. And Mindy, where can everyone find you?
Yeah, you can go to drmindipelz.com. I've got everything there. Of course, YouTube, I've got a great YouTube channel where I explain a lot of these. I got a new book coming out, Fast Like a Girl, where we're teaching women how to cycle 6 different length fasts to hormones. But if you forget all that, just go to my website.
And I'll link everything down below in the description, so you can find everything that she just mentioned down below in the box. And as always, I'll see you guys tomorrow. And Dr. Pelz, thanks for the time.
Oh, thank you, Thomas. This was fun.